Hi there. We have a perhaps disturbing new possibility arising in Ukraine. When the West installed the coup government in 2014, it sat back and waited and tolerated the Ukraine military heading over to Donbas and shelling and killing ethnic Russians, knowing that eventually Putin would have to respond, and then they would be able to start the timer, then say, look, mad Russia, and the West gets to attack and weaken and take down Russia, or regime change, and then it gets to carpetbag Russia, just as it carpetbagged Ukraine, handing over the natural resources to the Biden-Pelosi families and installing biolabs, etc., etc. All the while handing military aid and training to Ukraine so that it could go provoke the bear in the east. So we knew that, and we actually had come back to a fundamental problem. The best outcome for the West would have been, when I say for the West, for the war ending promptly, would be to let Putin do his thing. Ukraine had been carrying on its campaign against the Donbas for 8 years. Putin walks in, puts an end to that war, and it's notable how much of the actual fighting is being carried out by the Eastern Ukrainians. And fine, Ukraine loses some of its eastern and southern territory, and the West, suitably chastened, backs off. That obviously was not their intent. We've seen how they started the narrative the moment Russia invaded. They totally ignored the 8 years previous and their own actions to set up Ukraine. We totally ignore the fact that it was their own RAND organization which identified sanctions and arming Ukraine as key strategies that could weaken Russia, extend Russia. No, the West wanted this, and we knew that. But it looked like Russia, it still looks like Russia has basically it sorted out the south, Mariupol, a few Azov fighters still hiding, sheltering in the steel plant, and the Russian military grinding down the Ukrainian military in the east, so that eventually you would be left with an effectively defenseless Ukraine, at which point we would have seen what Putin intended. My personal sense is that, as others have pointed out, maybe Poland takes the West, because why not? It's there. But as far as Putin's concerned, he sorted out the killing, the war, the 8-year war, and he would have a couple of choices. He could extend westwards to the Dnieper River, maybe set up a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or he could simply declare the Ukraine east of the Dnieper to be a de facto DMZ, demilitarized zone. Basically saying, look, we have no interest in it, go about your lives, but don't install any troops or weapons there. We won't, you won't. That's our DMZ. And then what happened to the west of Ukraine would have been irrelevant. Now, however, well, that could still have happened had the West realized that, it had lost. It had poked the bear, and the bear was alive and well and had kicked the dogs out. so to speak, if setting dogs on the bear. But the West has escalated the rhetoric, and as we've seen, it's been pouring arms in, it's continuing the training. All of which wouldn't matter if Ukraine was obliged to treat that as, well, we're not dead yet, but here we are in the west of Ukraine, or whatever is left, depending on what Poland does, and the world settles down. But Scott Ritter raises the possibility that the arming and training of Ukrainians might be enough so that Ukraine continues to be a military threat or a military presence even after Putin ends the war, 8-year war in the Donbas. At which point, and this has been declared by America to be something they want, which is the Vietnamization of Ukraine, so that having first armed and trained Ukraine, set its thugs onto the eastern Ukrainians, provoked the war, provoked the Russian response. Now it wants to keep the war going by arming and training more Ukrainians, so they constitute an ongoing military threat, and pushing them to continue operations against Russia and against the Donbas, no matter what. No, we haven't lost yet. And there is an element of Monty Python and, the Black Knight or whoever it was, but this is definitely not funny. Because as long as the neocons, for want of a better word, in the US, sitting safe and pretty in their offices, in their think tanks, in America, supported by Johnson and Liz Truss in the UK, as long as they're more than happy for Russia to be at war against Western weapons, not against Western American and British troops yet, but as long as they are willing to keep the war going, as long as somebody's willing to provide the bodies, Ukraine, maybe even eventually Poland, and we'll cover that, then the West is not going to stop. Because why should they? They're sitting in offices in America. They're making a fortune. Their friends in the military industrial complex are making a fortune. They're destabilizing Russia. They're having a wild time. So they're not going to stop. So what happens then after Putin does indeed sort out the Donbas, if Ukraine does not accept that, yeah, that was pretty stupid and we should never have trusted the West, and look at Ukraine and look at the people. Zelensky, with his 600 million, is obviously not concerned about the Ukrainian people. PR, rhetoric, CGI, the West will use any resource to show that Ukraine is a fighting entity and keeping it going. But at some point, if Ukraine and Russia are to have some sort of future independently, somebody has to say, you know what, that's enough, let's back down. Now, apparently, America is still in Syria. I wasn't even aware that they actually had boots on the ground. Apparently they do. Amazing. America just doesn't back down. It won't stop. It won't stop until the war turns up in America. And that is a horrifying thought. Because realistically, who on earth is going to go and mount an invasion of America? No one. Which basically means America won't stop. There is only one thing that will stop America, and that is body bags, American body bags. As long as the dead are Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, German, British, America won't stop. They'll support their friends in the West and keep the war going at all costs, because it isn't costing them anything. They're making money hand over fist, courtesy of the taxpayer paying the military-industrial complex. They're loving sticking it to Russia, and they're sitting pretty. So yes, America learned that lesson well from Vietnam. In the first Iraq War, British pilots were flying low level, straight and level, along a runway to deliver cluster munitions. They did that a couple of times, and then they basically said, this is stupid, this is suicide, can we have some of your standoff missiles? America has learned to revere killing people without being at risk. It's exactly the opposite of the Western bravery, courage. You stand there and face down your enemy, and courtesy of your draw, your skill, your courage, you take him down. No, that's not the modern America. Modern America is you snipe the most hated and feared person on the battlefield. And America have turned him into a hero. You snipe, you kill from a distance. You make sure that your the body bags are only those of your enemy. You use drones, you use standoff missiles, you use anything you like, preferably not even American. Ukrainian youth, Ukrainian weapons. But hey, we've got Western weapons, but not our youth, not yet. America is just not going to stop. Not until American body bags start showing up. And that is a truly terrifying thought. And of course, Johnson, Liz Truss, totally in league with them. But what happens? Because the first outcome is that when Putin ends the war in the Donbas, an 8-year war coming to an end, which ought to be good news, when Putin takes down the NAZIs, again, something that the West should be doing rather than actually being the people knowing who they were, arming and training them and sending them forward. Once Putin has done exactly what he said he was going to do, which would have put an end to 8 years of war, that could or should have been the end of it. But with the US and UK and West starting the timer, starting the stopwatch from the moment that Russia invaded in response to that 8-year war, they made clear that this is a war they wanted. Then they made clear that they were going to do everything possible, short of sending actual British and American troops on the ground to do the fighting, but they still encouraged a few to go. They did everything possible to push this war to continue. And then they started openly declaring and calling it a war, and a proxy war. As long as Americans don't have to die, we should absolutely win this, finish this, no matter what. No off-ramp. Just keep going. It's truly terrifying. Because these aren't Russian troops at the border of America. These are NATO troops at the border of Russia, pushing for war, because it's what America wants. The RAND 2019 report, premeditation. And what happens if the West just will not stop? Because is Russia supposed to roll over? Russia's going to defend itself. Russia is going to do what it takes to protect its borders. America did. 2 buildings down, 3,000 people dead. An astonishing event. Well, that's good enough for Iraq. Again, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Russia's going to be different after 13,000 dead? Of course not. And NATO has already got 2 nations on the border, not counting Ukraine. It's fast-tracking Finland and Sweden to get 2 more on the border. What kind of insanity is this where you say, oh, we're just being defensive by advancing right up to your border? Russia is not America, sitting in glorious isolation with a subdued Canada and Mexico next to it. They ceased to be potential enemies a long time ago. No, America's sitting pretty. You can't hurt America, not without ICBMs. That's not going to happen, is it? So America has no need to stop, no desire to stop. It's loving what it's doing, and it's getting rich doing what it's doing. And what's going to happen to the West? We've already seen the inflation, food shortages, fuel shortages, only partly or indirectly related to Russia, but you start pushing for war, an unending war in Europe, which is what the Americans have set up and what they have triggered and what they are now pushing. Well, the Western Europe is going to have a pretty hard time. Because how should Russia respond? Now, as I say, my assessment was that once Donbas was done, the West, if it was sensible, say, yeah, you know, our bad, we got caught. We won't tell the media, we won't tell the public, but yeah, okay, you got us. They didn't really do a good job, did they? Oh well. Well, we got the sanctions against you. That didn't do as much as we hoped either. But okay, fine, that one's done. No, they're not even close to believing or desiring to do that. But had they called it quits then, Russia could have just said, as I said, West Ukraine, we're not fussed. Central Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, it's neutral, demilitarized zone. Just don't do anything there. Live there, be happy there, just don't put troops there. We won't, you won't. And that would have been it. Move on to the next crisis. But with the West continuing and pushing for a continuation of this war with fresh troops, though looking at the videos, they're young boys, that's not exactly encouraging. But let's say that Scott Ritter is right and there is a genuine threat and potential for a useful Ukraine military, not to defend its nation or to show some sort of military presence, but to actually actively and aggressively continue this war against Russia, backed by America. What is Russia going to do? It's going to have to recognize that, yeah, the West is not going to let it go. They poked us, they killed 13,000 of our people, we responded. They could have backed off, they're not going to back off. They're going to keep poking, they're going to keep the aggression on. Because every time we have to respond as Russia, the West gets to say in its controlled media, look bad Russia, and they get to keep the pressure on. They get to push the sanctions. They get to press for the Western supremacy, which is going to be a very Pyrrhic victory, certainly for Europe, probably also for America. But how must Russia respond? It is not going to give up defending the security of its nation. Look at the fuss America made over missiles in Cuba. Look at the fuss America made over 3,000 dead Americans and a couple of towers, regardless of who did it. No, the West set the precedent for this. The West showed the world what you're entitled to do when your people die. Well, the West then set its thugs on eastern Ukraine and killed ethnic Russians, Ukrainian Russians, Russian Ukrainians, whatever you want to call them. 13,000. If 3,000 is enough for 4 interventions, 2 invasions, 1 regime change, 1 failed regime change, then what does 13,000 allow? 1 intervention is a very, very modest demand. And of course it isn't even demand, just Russia is doing what America does, what America and the UK do. But if America won't stop, and if the attacks keep coming, the very first thing Russia is going to be obliged to do is say, okay, we're going to Kiev. Now, whether it stops short of Kiev and just, as I say, takes the east of Ukraine up to the Dnieper and has a DMZ for 10 kilometers or something and says, look, do you get it now? This is unacceptable. It's worse than it would have been if Ukraine had simply accepted that it had been too aggressive and accepted the original terms. It's worse than it would have been if the West, America, had not armed Ukraine in the first place and set its dogs on Russia. But it still leaves Ukraine, half of Ukraine, and they could stop there. Zelensky's got his 600 million, pity about Biden and Pelosi and their biolabs, but, you know, whatever. Next country. And it really is next country. I mean, that is truly horrific, that it is just, oh, let's move on to the next country then. But what if they don't stop? Not even on the outskirts of Kiev. What if the West keeps saying, oh no, don't worry, keep going, keep going. This is like Moscow. We're not going to surrender. Just losing Moscow doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. You can lose Kiev, it doesn't matter about it. And they keep sending missiles, artillery strikes, whatever, into the east to keep killing Russians, to keep the war going. Now what? Some point Russia has to say, well, you won't stop, and you're killing us from West Ukraine this time. What are we going to have to do about it? Well, I guess, because Russia isn't going to go back, so, well, we can't stop. I guess you're firing at us from West Ukraine. We'll have to go into West Ukraine. So the West, by its determination to have war with Russia, it could have not bothered in the first place. It could have let it go at Donbas in the south. It could yet, if it continues to push and Russia decides that, fine, we go to Kiev, it could stop there. But if it doesn't stop, now Russia has to consider taking the entirety of Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't matter to the neocons. Sure, they have an ancestral link to it, but they don't really care. They're not American voters. They're not American body bags. It won't stop the war. You know, what else can we do against Russia? So Russia takes the entire of Ukraine. Bloody, expensive. America winning massively as it arms the valiant resistance. Maybe Poland and other nations are sending troops in. Maybe Britain starts to send troops in. Maybe a few American advisors go in. But let's say that Russia eventually takes Western Ukraine as well. All because the West will not stop. Now what? Well, Russia has proved just how duplicitous it is. It said it just wanted to end the war in Donbas. Look at it, it's taken the entire of Ukraine. Yes, because you kept on using everything possible to keep killing Russians. You started killing Russians from 2014 onwards, or Russian Ukrainians, Ukrainian Russians, whatever, and you kept going. Eventually Russia responded, and you kept going, and you pushed for more war, and you kept going, and Ukrainians kept dying, and you kept going because you're safe in your American offices, spouting righteous indignation at Russia as you push for more war. Add it to the list. Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria failed. Now you've got Ukraine to take down Russia, costing Ukrainian lives. No voters lost, not a problem. And then what happens? Because after Ukraine, you're talking, what, Poland, Lithuania, Finland, Sweden. No American voters, but valiant people who will buy into the mad Russia narrative So ironically, if the West keeps killing Russians, no matter what Russia does to end that killing by taking the places where the killing was coming from, all NATO has to do is say, well, we've still got Poland, we've still got Austria, we've still got Germany. It's actually quite funny in a dark kind of way. It's like the neocons in America can keep pushing war until Russia has finally stopped all the people doing their best to kill Russians. And maybe they were in France, maybe they're in Britain. Putin has already shown the video saying, hang on a minute, you can fight us, you can arm and train Ukrainians. At some point we might take it seriously and you might have a flooding issue. The West never had to start it. Victoria Nuland, I name you. You set this up knowing it. You got Biden's permission. I name you too. Neocons of America, all of you who sat back and milked Ukraine, armed Ukraine, trained Ukraine, and sat back for 8 years while Ukrainians killed Ukrainians, and you are now pushing this war, even though Putin has shown that Russia will not roll over, Russia will not collapse, and it will stand by its kin. How many Americans were in Iraq? How many Americans were in Afghanistan? You had your 3,000 American dead on 9/11. We know, you know, and we know who killed them. But hey, let's not go there. You had your 3,000 American dead. You've used it to take down enemies of a certain country, Iraq twice, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and you failed in Syria. Why? Because you came up against the Russians. Funny that. And now you're doing it again in Ukraine. You love war. It is despicable. It is unconscionable. And the sickening and disturbing realization I had this morning when Scott Ritter suggested that, yeah, maybe the West arming and training Ukrainians might be enough to keep Ukraine militarily viable, to turn this into a Vietnam for Russia. I realized that it's not even just Vietnam. This is the domino theory in reverse. No doubt you learned that well. This is, because you can never reach us, because you can never get us, because we're safe, surrounded by 2 oceans and 2 meek countries who are not going to attack us. We can keep going, we can keep going, we're gonna hit you, we're gonna hit you. And everyone that assists you in killing Russians is sooner or later going to have to be confronted by Russia. You didn't have to start this. And Russia is going to keep going until people stop trying to kill Russians. You started Ukrainians killing Russians. Who will you have next killing Russians? Because when Americans get killed, you respond. What do you think Russia's going to do? You want to kill Russians? I have a suggestion.